Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. And if you haven't done it already, please hit the like button. Please subscribe. Please click the bell so you always get notified whenever we go live. As the show is growing, we are constantly adding days and new shows. As we said earlier in the week, we are actually adding a sports show, which should be not next week, but the week after that will probably be our first episode with that. So, and also we're going to be adding some of Doug Lane's critical cuts are going to be on this show, as well as we're going to be doing more video essays. I reworked a video essay that I had done, or Pascal and I had done for Zero Books when we were still doing content for Zero Books, called The Great Awakening. Check it out. It is live on the channel now. Without any further ado, let me bring in the author of that Great Awakening piece. He is my homie, my dog. He is the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He is the Pascal Robert. Give it up.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
Hola. My Spanish is so bad, by the way. Whenever I walk into a place and I try to speak Spanish, they just stop me and just speak English. Don't even, please stop. So I need to work on it.
I can believe that.
It's bad. Our next guest, I shouldn't say guest, our next guest host, of course, is a member of the This is Revolution family. He's part of the Thursday Foreign Policy crew. He is also an integral part of the middle management of the Death Star. You know him as Deep State Kuba. We know him as Deep State Kuba. He is Deep State Kuba.
Hello, everyone. After the show, the relevant people will be notified of their imperial termination. Done a great job, but we're going in a new direction, and your labor will no longer be needed. We will be needing your blood and plasma, however, so make sure to drop that out with your uniforms. Happy holidays also.
So before we bring in our guest, I do want to thank everyone that has purchased a Anglo Pessimism shirt. It definitely was a joke. I didn't think it would do as well as it did. It's pretty hilarious. But some of the suggestions you guys had that I wrote down the other day have me thinking,
Oh, there was Jason. So,
speaking of imperial terminations.
The most imperial of terminations. But yes, check out the merch for sure. And Jason's back.
Yeah, sorry. Kuba, stop doing that. Here I am trying to help you out, and then you're like, nope, I don't want a shirt.
Right here. No, I'm just sore that they wouldn't take my order because they claim that the address doesn't exist just because it's in no public record and doesn't appear on any map.
There you go.
And we're also working on a Pascal Robert Mau Mau shirt. We're going to go, the voting has come in. They want to see blue Dr. Manhattan, buff shirtless Pascal, showing everything but the blue weenie. And yeah, it's comics, don't worry about it, but blue weenie. You would have a blue weenie. Sorry. I don't write comics.
Way TMI.
Your blue weenie.
I mean, is it?
No.
Well, let's.
I don't have high enough clearance to get that part of your record.
You don't have weenie clearance.
I mean, that's something.
Also,
It's like
you
being
can
a
tell
made man in the mafia.
you can tell I'm a dad because I'm calling a grown man's junk a weenie.
Hello.
You got a blue bing bang.
Mm.
So let's
bang
bring,
to that bang.
let's bring in our poor guest that has to sit through this. Our guest today is Chris Cutrone. Chris Cutrone is a college educator, writer, and media artist committed to critical thinking and artistic practice and the politics of social emancipation. Born in 1970 and raised in Valley Stream on Long Island near New York City, Cutrone is an adjunct associate professor in the departments of art, history, theory, and criticism, and visual and critical studies at the School of Art Institute of Chicago, and instructor at the Institute for Clinical Social Work. Please welcome, without any further ado, the Chris Cutrone.
Hi guys.
Chris, how are you?
Good. How's it going?
Pretty good. Sorry you had to sit through so much childish banter, but it loosens up the mood, and it's fun to, make fun of a grown man's junk. But you sent us a piece that actually just went up, I think yesterday, in the Platypus Review. And it's about your life and you becoming a leftist. You're from Long Island, and in your piece, you say you got radicalized in Marxism in your high school years reading the Communist Manifesto. What was the political climate like in your area in Long Island at this time, which is, mid 80s? What was the political climate like for you? Like who put the Communist Manifesto in your hands? Because there wasn't a
Well, yeah.
But
Right.
we got to the end of the question.
Yeah.
We would like you to name names. Please provide contact information if at all possible.
Right. So it's the Reagan era. And, a couple of things really very early in adolescence. I dressed as a World War I soldier for Halloween. And a friend of my mother's asked me, "Are you about to be deployed to Grenada?" And I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" And the US was invading Grenada. And that got me thinking. It wasn't long after that I read the Communist Manifesto. And who put it in my hand? It's a little bit fuzzy, but I think it was my friend's older sister who was responsible for exposing us to a lot of stuff, including new wave music and, literature, Kafka, Camus, but Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto.
Well, what's really interesting, Chris, is that you and I are contemporaries in age, although I might be a little bit older. I'm also from New York. I'm from Queens. And what's really fascinating about your trajectory into the left politics coming through your exposure to the Communist Manifesto is that it reckons me back to my youth growing up as a teenager and a young adult in the Reagan era, and how much I think that when we look at today's contemporary politics, people are really unaware of how a very much of a right-wing consensus dominated the social, political, and just overall climate of American society, to the point where the notion of opposition was kind of almost futile. And I think that we it was almost a period of I wouldn't say non-politics, but almost post-politics in some ways, in terms of where America was. So what fascinates me is that how exactly did you find any kind of space to develop the politics and consistent dedication to a left, particularly Marxian critique of capitalism, going from the 80s and 90s in a period of time that really was focused on the end of history kind of discourse, that there was no other option besides what we, as the book, Mark Fisher's book, capitalist realism?
Yeah, so it wasn't quite that yet when I was first coming to consciousness, and I was a little precocious, I guess. Um, you know, so it wasn't, quite the fall of the Soviet Union yet. So me and my friends, we were a little bit punk, a little bit, rebellious. We wouldn't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance or for the national anthem. And, one of our conservative history teachers said, even the Soviet ambassador stands for the national anthem. And I said, yeah, that's his problem.
You wouldn't stand, but did you take a knee?
No, that wasn't a thing yet.
Mm.
And anyway, that would have been a gesture of respect that we were not interested in performing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, I don't know, counter-identification with, the conservatism of the time. I was definitely like an anti-Reagan person. Like, I hated Reagan. I hated everything he stood for. I hated the family, friends, families, everybody, right? I mean, it's a kind of it's a weird moment, Pascal. So basically, I also remembered the 70s, right?
As do I.
And so I remembered the misery. My father was unemployed for a while in the recession of the 70s. Definitely took a toll. We got the government cheese. We got the food stamps. We got the government aid. And there was just this sense, very post 60s also. So I had that sense as well. Vietnam wasn't that long ago. And it was, even though there was a kind of conservatism, it was sort of unsettled, and so I knew that there was something wrong. I knew that there was something going on. And I think when I read the manifesto, things crystallized for me. And in ways that maybe parts of it resonated with me that are not typical, right? So I remember being really moved by the critique of reactionary socialism, by the idea that we're going to go back to a better time, try to undo capitalism, that kind of thing. I don't know. It was just an interesting moment of counter-identification with the Cold War conservatism, Reagan, like the second Cold War. And I remember, like, I would see on the news footage of these helicopters, Soviet helicopters in Afghanistan and Soviet helicopters in Nicaragua fighting the Contras. And I was like, okay, there's a conflict going on. How do I feel about that? Which side am I on? And I felt like I was on the other side.
Well, it's really fascinating that you said that, right? Because I some of your narrative here I can identify with, because as someone who was growing up at the same period of time, also remembering the 70s, and also, going to Catholic high schools in New York City at that time, I had family members who lived in the Soviet Union at the time. As a matter of fact, one of the things I mentioned on the show is that I have two uncles who left Haiti. My parents are originally from Haiti to go study in the Soviet Union in the late 60s, early 70s. So that kind of sense of I don't understand why people have a problem with the Soviets. You're not bad people, kind of thing, was also something that was very much a part of my worldview during the Reagan era as well. But I'm going to pivot to Kuba here because I'm sure Kuba has some questions he wants to jump in on. It's also.
So you said that in this conflict and in Nicaragua, you felt like you were on the other side. And did you feel like it was a binary Cold War style between Soviet Union and the United States, or was the side that you were on something different than Soviet style communism? And where do you put that energy if you are faced with this bipolar world?
Right. No, I mean, I think that I understood that maybe I didn't fit on either side, maybe, but I also was kind of glad that there was another side. It was a very primitive, I'm talking about being a young adolescent, 13, 14, 15 years old. And kind of an inchoate sense. And I eventually challenged my own thinking along those lines. In other words, once I encountered the left, then I had to deal with the left's like anti-Reaganism and Reagan's a fascist and this kind of thing. And I thought, well, that's not quite right either, right? Because on the one hand, I hated the conservatism, I hated the Reaganite Cold War. There was something clearly rotten about it. But on the other hand, I felt like why people like my family and friends' families would have been conservative, would have like maybe voted for Reagan, was complicated, right? In other words, it was kind of a post-60s dejection, a sense of like disappointment, cynicism, and so it's not exactly that I accepted the bipolarity of the world as it presented itself. But like I said, at first, in a very primitive way, I was just glad that there was another side, that there was like some pushback, But then when I encountered the left, I was like, well, the left is trying to tell me something about my family and my community that is accurate, but not quite right either.
Incomplete.
Yeah, and so yeah, it's complicated. And of course, later when I went to Hampshire College, because I was a leftist and I wanted to go to a lefty school, then I was like, oh shit, I don't really belong here. This is a school for rich kids.
Well, I want to ask you about that.
Right.
You said in your your time, your the piece is about your thought process and your maturation as a leftist, right? From a young high school age man to a grown man. You say in your piece that you felt predisposed towards respecting Trotsky as a dissident figure. What was it exactly about Trotsky's teachings that connected with a young Chris Cutrone?
I hardly knew anything about it. In other words, what I knew was that there was like the original revolution, and then there was some kind of degeneration of the revolution. And that, it's Snowball,
Mm-hmm.
right? In Animal Farm.
Mm-hmm.
What does he represent? A kind of idealism, a kind of a tragic figure.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really know much of the details, but I thought, okay, the Soviet Union came from something good, but went wrong somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow still had something to do with that original.
So you see him as more of a tragic figure?
At that point, because I hadn't read any. I had read Ernest Mandel's Revolutionary Marxism Today,
Mm-hmm.
which is a strange book, either from the late 70s, I think, or early 80s, and has a kind of a melancholic tone to it and discusses fairly abstruse Trotskyist points that I just didn't quite understand. But I felt like, okay, here's someone who's saying something about Marxism and something about the Soviet Union, something about the Russian Revolution that is critical but substantial, right? That isn't just some kind of, oh, they're totalitarian and the Russian Revolution was horrible and look at all the death and violence. So I knew that there was something there, but I didn't really understand what it was until later, until I encountered the Spartacist League. And I was skeptical even then, but I was open.
Now, before you go any further, can
Right.
you tell us a little bit about because I'm sure not everybody that watches this show is familiar with the Spartacus League. Can you tell us a little bit about the Spartacus League and what drew you to the Spartacus League?
Well, I mean, it was somewhat of an accident. There was a friend of mine who had met them and had set up a meeting with them and asked me and my boyfriend to go with her to the meeting because she didn't want to go by herself. And she knew that we were Marxists. And so she was like, okay, you guys can tell me what's what. You can tell me whether they're legit or not. And we're like, okay. And we engaged them and immediately got into kind of an argument about, the Russian Revolution and Lenin and this and that. And, we were kind of fascinated. And so we stayed in touch with them. But I'm not sure that I had heard of them. It's possible that I had seen them at a demo in New York as a teenager, but I didn't remember. I remembered like Revolutionary Worker, RCP. I remembered Socialist Worker, ISO. I don't know if I remember Workers' Vanguard. I don't think that I bought any of their papers at the demos.
I did.
Right? I might have, I might not have. I might have just missed them. But, the other thing that really got me with the Spartacist League was they were critical of the left. In other words, I bought a copy of Workers' Vanguard from them when we met them, took it back, me and my friends in the dorm looking at Workers' Vanguard, and it's just polemic after polemic about the left. And that felt right. That felt like, okay, they're exposing some bullshit. I had encountered a lot of bullshit as a high school student doing Central American solidarity and South Africa solidarity. Not with like Marxist organizations, but like American Friends Service Committee, Catholic Worker, secular humanists, and, also talking to leftists from Central America and South Africa who had this, I think that I say in my article, they said, well, the U.S. will never go socialist. And I said, why not? And they said, well, because the working class voted for Reagan. And I was like, what kind of an argument is that? So I was open to the critique of the left that the Spartacists offered. Let's put it that way.
How did you recognize, how did your bullshit detector work at that point?
Maybe I already detected that the anti-Reaganism was like a kind of an alibi for liberal bullshit.
Like class-coded.
I don't know. I mean, it definitely had that feel to it. But it also, I had the sense that the Democrats, it's interesting because it's like Jesse Jackson's campaigns. And I remember Jesse Jackson saying, we should be not, look, we should be on the other side. So he talked about the frontline states in Southern Africa and how Reagan was propping up, the apartheid regime and this kind of Cold War, proxy war, Angola, Mozambique, this kind of stuff. And Jesse Jackson was like, we should be supporting the states that Reagan's attacking to put pressure on South Africa, apartheid South Africa. And I was like, oh, that's pretty edgy. But I also thought, what's this about? In other words, that it was being turned into a kind of Democratic Party anti-Reaganism. So, I mean, there was a lot of bullshit detecting going off. It was just a very different environment. I think it's hard for younger people to really grasp. Because it's very close to the 60s still. And also the 70s. And I was kind of not very aware of the 70s left, like that phase of the new left. I had more of a sense of the recession, the downturn of the 70s.
So you mentioned that, sorry.
Go ahead.
You mentioned that this is a very different moment than it was in the 80s. In some ways, it feels like there's a great deal of energy on the right. Neoliberalism has reshaped America in quasi-Reaganite way. Do you see some structural similarities? And,
between then and now.
Yeah, and in terms of the feel, what would you point to as being the big difference
I would
between these two
redirect that a little
eras?
bit. So,
Okay.
I'm kind of notorious. I mean, we used to be, me and Platypus used to be notorious in the anti-war movement era for criticizing the anti-war movement. Then we became notorious for an article that I wrote that really was meant to be a kind of...
Well, real quick, what did you have against the anti-war movement? Are you talking about the anti-war movement of the early 90s?
Of the zeros, of the millennial moment, right?
So Iraq War.
Iraq War, okay.
War on Terror, yeah. I mean, kind of from the beginning. I mean, I would say that the Afghanistan War and then the Iraq War, and obviously the anti-war movement with the Afghanistan War was pretty limited, but it was there. It was there. And again, it was like George W. Bush is a fascist. He's launching a Christian crusade, like this kind of thing. And I just thought, well, as if the Democrats would be different if they were in office, right? And also, I thought, well, what about Saddam Hussein, who I remembered from the Gulf War? And I remember the crushing of the uprising after the Gulf War. And, like the Shia uprising, the Kurdish uprising, I remember all that. And I'm like, okay, so you're really going to say that there isn't a problem here, that there isn't like a failed state, that there isn't like Iraq's losing its sovereignty. It's like, has no fly zones. It has U.S. planes patrolling. Like, I felt like this war, was kind of built up for a very long time. Madeleine Albright had said 1 million dead Iraqis due to the sanctions was worth it. And I felt like the anti-war movement was all about anti-Bushism. It was all anti-George W. Bush, as if that was the problem, as if it were George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. That's what the war is about. And so, again, that's the sort of formative moment of Platypus. And I also had a sense that, the Iraqi left was not pro-Saddam Hussein, was not happy to simply be anti-U.S. imperialist, as if that's the only question. I mean, it's the predominant question, of course, but it's not the only question. So, I'm not sure how we got quite a little bit sidetracked on because I said that there are two moments of notoriety. One is the anti-war movement, but the other is Trump. And so the way Trump resonates with me with the Reagan era, I felt like I'm not going to make this mistake twice. And also my students, I felt like I'm not going to let them make the mistake I made as a young person of allowing Trump to symbolize everything that's wrong with the United States, right? As if the same things weren't wrong under Obama.
You
right?
bring up Trump, Reagan, George W. Bush.
Right.
Do you think that there's something particular about the United States or about the American political system that personalizes political stances and concentrates attention on personalities rather than looking at deep structures or the continuities that lead to crisis points like the 2008 financial crash or the war on terror?
I mean, it's an interesting thing. Obviously, the presidency in the United States is a big deal. It's more than a prime minister, But I imagine, from what I understand, Margaret Thatcher was just as symbolic as Reagan in the 80s as a leader. And so I'm not sure that, and they basically have a two-party system too in Britain. And so I'm not sure that there's something unique about the United States in that regard. The two-party system or the presidency as being head of state as well as head of government, that adds to it. But I really think, I was very disillusioned by Bill Clinton getting elected after Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush. And so there is something about the charismatic personality. So Clinton, Obama, you know, they weren't able to pull it off quite with Hillary or Biden, but certainly Clinton and Obama as the Democrat presidents during my conscious lifetime as a political person. I guess they traded on a lot of personal charisma. I guess that's true. And I guess by contrast, there was a vilification of Reagan and a vilification of George W. Bush and a vilification of Trump, certainly. Right? Even though those are very different cases.
Is there also an element where, because people are socialized to believe that the system is legitimate, that this works, problems and scandals, decisions that are seen as not just mistaken but morally odious, things like the invasion of Iraq, is there a need to try to moralize them as a fault, as a kind of spiritual, psychological, personal fault, personal flaw in a leader, rather than a reflection of how the system operating as usual?
Right. I mean, I think so, but I'm not sure that that's unique to the United States. In other words, I think it's just the primitive level of politics. And I guess what I've learned, being a Marxist for a while, I've learned war is not a moral issue. War is a political issue. And in other words, there certainly is moral iniquity in war, and it's very sordid. Like, I've certainly known people in the U.S. military, people who served in the Gulf War, people who served in the War on Terror. And of course, it's quite a rotten affair. Of course, the military is quite something. And for that very reason, it has to be glorified in the way that it is. But I see that as essentially a political and social matter rather than as a moral matter, And so it's kind of like, well, nothing good is going to come out of a war, certainly. War is going to involve crime. There's not going to be a war without war crimes, for sure. But that's not my focus, right? My focus is not in the, just raw human suffering inflicted by war militarily, and the inevitable abuses that go along with all that.
Thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so I think of it as politics. And of course, the U.S., is the global hegemon, has been and probably will continue to be. But it's not the only political actor in the world, right? So, in other words, it's not as if, again, like Saddam Hussein or the Taliban have no power. And also, it's not as if they're not political. They are, right? And they do things according to a political calculus. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, their actions are political.
I thought they hated us for our freedom.
Now I want to shift focus a little bit. I want to just shift a little bit here because
Right.
there's a few things I want to definitely get to in this first hour, and definitely we have a whole freaking plan for you, Cutrone.
All right.
But in all seriousness, you are a fan of Adorno, and I want to ask you, what drew you to Adorno?
It's a good question, because I think
And
my first
is Gramsci
exposure,
a Stalinist?
right? My first exposure to Adorno was a little unimpressive. So, in some film studies class, I read the culture industry chapter of the Dialectic of Enlightenment, and I was like, yeah, I guess so. But it didn't really have any teeth for me at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading, the kind of cultural studies Marxists like Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, Jameson, probably, although I don't quite recall, in college. And Gramsci, I read, it's interesting, we, in a class, we read from the prison notebooks, but then I went out and got like his early political writings. So the pre-prison writings, which I actually found a lot more substantial than the prison writings. But again, I was kind of like, all right, this makes sense in some ways. Adorno, right? So in thinking about Western Marxism, if you will, Adorno and the Frankfurt School were a little bit oblique and unknown to me. They were sort of out there. I probably knew something about Marcuse, but again, I didn't like read it. Or I think the first thing I read by Marcuse was One Dimensional Man, and it didn't really resonate. It didn't. So it was only later, it was post-Spartacist League, post-college, that I read Adorno seriously. And that's due to Adolf Reed. And it's also due to an old dear friend of mine, Reginald Shepard, who's a poet, and who would also come up in like postmodernist academia, and had been exposed to Adorno that way through kind of Marxist literary criticism. And so it was within a kind of art context. I became aware of the fact that he wrote about other things, about psychology, sociology, philosophy. But the original encounter was art and philosophy. Philosophy, though, Adolf Reed told me to read Negative Dialectics. But he also told me to read Prisms, it was a collection of essays, and Minima Moralia. And I felt like these were very difficult texts. And I didn't, basically 80% of it went over my head. But the 20% that, it felt like reading Marx's Das Kapital, which I tried in college too. I felt like I don't know what the hell's going on here. I want to know, I want to like it, I want to agree, but it's just, 85% is going over my head. Similar case with Adorno, but I felt like he was talking about something. Like there was a kind of inferential quality. I knew that there was Marxism there. It seemed sort of hidden. It seemed to be this kind of esoteric core to his thinking. And I don't think that I would have been able to read Adorno that way if I hadn't been educated by the Spartacists in Marxism, if I hadn't gotten hardcore Marxism, if I didn't have a sense of, the trajectory of the 20th century, the failure, betrayal of the revolution, this kind of stuff. If I didn't know about Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and Trotsky, if I didn't have that entry into Marxism, probably Adorno would have meant something very different to me, because I certainly didn't understand his references to philosophy. I didn't have any philosophy background, at that point. But I knew, okay, this is Marxism, that much was clear. And I thought, oh, he's really talking about some interesting issues with regards to Marxism, and I wanted to know more. Right, so that sort of got me on a trajectory of studying Adorno, especially about art. The way he talked about the relationship between art and politics also strongly resonated with me.
If I could try to tie things together, we talked about how the left especially personalizes, vilifies particular right-wing leaders, how that's a bit of a smokescreen away from the structural forces that lead to these developments that are highly destructive. Your article talks about the need to re-examine the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a necessary phase. Could you, and with Adorno, with the other theorists, you have your theoretical foundation. What are the structures behind the personalities that need to be challenged, need to be confronted, and how do you change them?
All right, good question. So, I was sold on Marx early on. I didn't quite understand the full implications of it. And the dictatorship of the proletariat's not in the Communist Manifesto. It's something that he formulates later. But I had this sense of capitalism being this revolutionary engine in society, but also this contradictory and crisis-ridden phenomenon. And, you know, I mentioned the critique of like reactionary socialism and conservative socialism. The other thing that resonated with me was this, kind of call and response part of the manifesto, where it's like communists stand accused of wanting to destroy the family and profane everything that's holy, but it's actually capitalism that's doing that. And communists stand accused of wanting to abolish private property, but actually it's capitalism that's doing that. That kind of dialogical part of the manifesto, the kind of call and response part. And in other words, I had a sense of the relationship between communism and capitalism being one of a dialectic and being about fulfilling the potential of capitalism. In other words, that communism was based on capitalism, that you couldn't have communism without capitalism. And that capitalism was essentially nothing but the necessity for communism, like historically. That's the only way it could be understood. That it wasn't like greed and evil and, some kind of moral failure and some kind of wrong turn that humanity took, but that it was this crisis and revolutionary opportunity, possibility, and necessity. And that stuck with me, that idea. So Adorno, to kind of bring it back around, and then I'll come around to the Spartacist League, when Adorno says something like philosophy lives on because the moment for its abolition miscarried, like the beginning of negative dialectics, like that kind of thing, I kind of intuitively knew what he meant in terms of an unfulfilled potential that kind of informed the society. Now, the Spartacist League, made it a lot more concrete. In other words, the education that I got from them was essentially on the history of Marxism and how that history culminated in a particular moment around, the revolutions after World War I, Russian, German revolutions after World War I, and gave me a sense of a tangible possibility and a political necessity, a political task, like something very concrete that could have happened but didn't happen, right? But a real possibility that went unfulfilled. And I think that again, the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's like this kind of funny phrase that people spin one way or another, reinterpret, try to avoid or try to explain away or try to blunt in some way. And again, I felt like what I learned from the Spartacist League was about the history of Marxism. It was about the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and it was also about like the political party to achieve it, and the political party to achieve it not being the party state of the Soviet Union or of communist China, right? So not, in other words, that it wasn't this totalitarian notion of either the dictatorship of the proletariat or the party to achieve it. I understood that wasn't the original Marxist mission. That wasn't the original Marxist conception or practice. In other words, I knew that Lenin wasn't a totalitarian, right? He wasn't like a personal dictator looking to establish a totalitarian regime. And so, the negative character of the left, was always drilled into me. My experience of the left was always, well, Marxism's good, but Soviet Union went wrong, or Marxism's good, but the Leninist party is wrong. Marxism is good, but the dictatorship of the proletariat, that's kind of an outmoded idea, and maybe it was wrong to begin with. And, I smelled a rat there. I
Well,
knew that was wrong.
I want to ask Pascal, because we talked about this a little earlier today when we were going over the show. You have your own opinion on the framing of that term, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Would you like to?
Yeah, my larger concern I had with the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat is that it actually makes the capacity of expanding a non-capitalist politics or Marxist politics to someone who is unfamiliar with the language and the rhetoric, and it turns them off. Quite
Yep.
frankly, I mean, I understand how you can explain it in a way that puts power in the hands of workers and so on and so forth, but I think that it's a term, frankly, that is somewhat. I mean, yes, I understand it's a Marxist term, but I think it has an anti-Marxist effect. And it actually rationalizes some of the worst talking points that those who are enemies of Marx and Marxism use to categorize the whole concept of an intellectual critique of capitalism as some kind of totalitarian oppressive phenomenon.
Yep. For sure. I mean, I guess it comes down to this. Who are we trying to convince? Right? In other words, yes, right? Like, certainly my fellow students at Hampshire College, right? My graduate students, even the lefty ones at the University of Chicago, yeah, they don't like it, right? They don't like, they're turned off. Again, it's kind of this funny term that immediately, of course, has this negative resonance. I'm not sure that, I don't know that we lead with that in terms of politics. I think theoretically, talking about the left, like, I definitely want to, tell Jacobin DSA, yeah, but are you working for the dictatorship of the proletariat? Bhaskar, is that your goal? Is that where we're going here? And, they would say, yes, right? They would just interpret it a different way. They would say, well, we want a working class, ultimately, we want a working class party to take power. And it's just a question of how you get there, right? Like, they would interpret it a little bit differently, especially the process and also what it represents. They would be like, you want a working class majority, maybe, to be elected. And that would be the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's what Marx meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it's kind of like, well, okay, maybe, maybe not, right? But, there, so it sort of turns off people who are in the know. It also doesn't turn off people who are in the know. In terms of the general public, it probably means almost nothing, because dictatorship means whatever, obviously. And proletariat, what the hell is the proletariat? So both words are totally alienating to
dictatorship sounds bad because that's the villain in action movies.
Right, but if you say, like, the working class should, like, rule, right? Like, the Spartacist.
That sounds way better than the dictatorship of Chuck Norris.
I don't know, man. Right? Like, I've seen him do kung fu.
Is Chuck Norris a proletarian?
Yes.
He plays one on TV.
Oh, right. Right.
Pascal, I know you had some more questions you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to really talk about how exactly does this play out in terms of the contemporary manifestation of what is called the left, because I would make the argument that we don't have a left, we have leftists in America today. And I heard your explanation of what your positions were on Lenin, the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. And there are many of those positions I totally disagree with, but I can understand, coming from the vantages that you make, but not so much that I disagree, quite frankly. But I find that part of the problem I have with the left overall, and not because I think that some of your critiques are fair, is that I feel that we are getting into conversations about dead places, dead people, dead things, and dead phenomenon in these very, very obscure kind of sophisticated ways that frankly have nothing to do with appealing to most working people in America. And what ends up being rendered is a type of leftism that's really kind of a faculty lounge, nerd geek, almost like chess club of thought that has absolutely nothing to do with the real, actual life of most people
That's fair. That's
who
fair.
need to actually challenge the way capitalism works,
That's
and as a
fair. I mean,
consequence, end up being completely enamored with the reactionary right.
all right. So let me I guess let me pose it as maybe a dual audience problem, if we could put it that way. Which is to say, when talking to the left, you're really talking like leftists. You're really talking to intelligentsia. You're talking to intellectuals, and I feel like with them, it's like you got to take a hard line and be like, okay, but really, are you for the dictatorship of the proletariat? Now, organizing workers, so I have like two hats that I've worn in the last 15 years since I've been brought out of retirement. I retired from politics as a 23-year-old. I was like, done. My students brought me back, and the two hats I've worn since they brought me back out of mothballs, I'm like, okay, so you want to do Marxism? Let's see how you like this. Is Platypus Affiliated Society, which is totally ideological and intellectual, right? And campus based and all that. And dealing with definite petty bourgeois, intellectual type, student type people. The Campaign for a Socialist Party, which is more of a sort of you know, low intensity warfare kind of semi underground operation trying to do activism. And of course, if you try to organize working class people in a very concrete way, you don't lead in with Marxism, you don't lead in with the dictatorship of the proletariat, because it's pretty much irrelevant. In other words, the level that we're at now, in terms of building any kind of like socialist left, is very primitive, meaning Marxism comes in at a higher level of development that we're just not at, right? And so the way that I put it in that context is socialists today are, by virtue of circumstance, condemned to do liberal activism. And what I mean by liberal activism is basic organizing, which you don't need Marxism to understand or justify ideologically. You could understand and justify it just on a kind of liberal, democratic, civil, social. You want the workers to organize independently of the state, independently of capitalist corporations, independently of foundation NGOs. Like you want to build the capacity.
A league of their own.
Yeah, you want to build their capacity to organize their own lives, and that really has to take place independently of capitalist politics. It has to happen independently of whatever the law is and whatever capitalist policy is. I'll take a just straight up example since it's ripped from the headline. Supreme Court might overturn Roe versus Wade, right? Well, socialists organized women and workers and had socialist doctors performing abortions, whether or not abortion was legal or illegal, right? Like, in other words, they organized at that level. Like, doesn't matter. The state tells you can do it. The state tells you can't do it. We're going to try to provide this for the working class anyway.
That makes me think of the Polish shadow state during Nazi occupation, where you had government that had coercive authority, it had power, and it had it issued laws and decrees, it ordered public life. But to a certain extent, that was irrelevant because actual life of the Polish people under occupation was organized by the shadow state that operated in
Probably
parallel.
by the Catholic Church a lot.
The Catholic Church was part of it, yes, but there was there were communists, and there was a pro-Soviet mini shadow state, and leftists of non-Soviet stripes were part of the sort of mainstream, the larger operation. And like you said, it didn't matter what the diktat came down from Berlin. You recognized it, and you recognized it as a hazard and as a reality, but that didn't alter your own calculus about what needed to be done and what you could do.
Right. You know,
an obstacle, not a structure.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think that the problem with the left today, to get back to my kind of anti-democratic party mindset, is that I think the left today thinks first we have to elect Democrats, and the Democrats have to pass all these laws and institute this welfare state, and then maybe we can start to struggle for socialism. And I'm like, no, that's totally ass backwards. Right? And essentially, you know, the program of socialists is the same whether you're living in a liberal democracy, a dictatorship, a fascist regime. Does not matter, right? The essential task is the same, which is to organize the working class to act independently. That's the task. That's the same. And there are better and worse conditions for that, of course. You have to take advantage of whatever conditions obtain. But it's not as if, you know, and so let's think about it, right? Like the Trump era. It's like fight the right, stop fascism, you know, get rid of Trump as a precondition. It's like, no, that's not a precondition. Right? And so that turns into, well, socialists are just going to be the most militant Democratic Party types. They're just going to be the people who insist on the most seemingly left policies on the part of the Democrats and are essentially working towards that end. Right? I mean, that's like I was saying earlier, this is the primitive character of where we're at.
I feel you on that point, and you kind of touch on that in your writing, and I definitely want to get on that in the bonus half. So we're coming to the end of the hour. This was a great conversation.
This is a big teaser.
Yeah, that's what I do, Chris. I'm a great big
hey, you know that those patron dollars don't come in for nothing.
So we're going to get into that. There's actually some more questions we want to ask you.
Join us in the champagne room.
That's why it's called the after hours. It's like once the show's over, there's the velvet rope is up, and then
there's the after party and the after party.
This is the after party where you do all the crazy talking and you tell all the stories that you could never say, not behind the wall.
Mm-hmm.
So get ready, because we're definitely taking a deeper dive into this conversation, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Definitely want to talk more about the 90s and the 80s and what you saw, because you had said some interesting things that really caught my attention about the riots, or the whatever you call the uprisings, 91, 92.
LA riots. Yep.
And so I definitely want to talk about that. So maybe we should call it the champagne room. And we're having this chat conversation about the wonderfulness of Denny's and how much I miss it being here in Mexico. So I think we should do a Denny's This is Revolution tour, where we go to different Denny's and we get a big table, separate checks.
I remember when we were supposed to boycott Denny's.
Well, because they wouldn't serve black people.
Denny's?
Yeah,
I
it's
never,
totally
I never
fine.
did boycotts, by the way.
It's fine. I
Yeah,
was
exactly.
trying to boycott Denny's, and then all the black people I knew worked there, so it was like, okay,
Yeah, who
they're
are you
not gonna tell
boycotting?
me-
Right.
Yeah. And someone says
No.
Denny's is trash. It is trash, but it's very delicious at 2 a.m. when nowhere else is open, and you don't live in a cool place like New York where you can get some delicious pizza, right, Pascal? You people love your
True
pizza.
that. New York has great pizza.
Yeah, it's just
I miss it.
Oh, Chris is a New Yorker too. Shit, maybe we should
Yep.
have Chris and Pascal
Chicago
talk
pizza,
about.
not quite.
That's the best shit in the world.
Lasagna, man. It's nothing but a pasta pie.
Yeah, it's not
cake.
really
It's
pizza.
a pasta cake.
Sounds great.
Giorgiano's, Lou Malnati's. You're in the heart of all that good ass deep
I learned to
dish.
appreciate it, but it's still not the same.
It's a pasta cake.
Yep.
Well,
As opposed to a cardboard chip.
No. They have what's called the cracker crust in Chicago.
a
which is
greasy
really
ass
bad.
cardboard chip.
You're
So
from Canada. What are you eating? Ice rocks? Come on, man.
Yes. I mean, they come in different flavors. You dip them in your coffee. I mean, how else do you start your day?
Kuba has the greatest breakfast place in North America in Vancouver. I love that breakfast place. Every time I have to go to tour Vancouver, I get so fucking giddy. The last time we were there in 2019, it was like the highlight of our goddamn tour was going to that place for breakfast. I love it. I love it.
Come up and I'll treat you.
You've said nothing but a word. Once I get tires, because this dirt road has destroyed my car. So thank you guys. If you are a patron, we will see you in the bonus after hours. Maybe we should call it the champagne room for 2022, Pascal. What do you think?
Neither one of us drinks champagne.
I don't drink
Deep State
champagne
Cuba
at all.
presents the TIR Champagne Room. I came up with it. I want some credit.
Gigi says Cracker Barrel. I love Cracker Barrel because I love grits as a side.
I do love
Yeah,
grits
Cracker
to the
Barrel ain't
side,
bad either.
but the name
Cracker
Cracker
Barrel is the
Barrel
shit.
just makes me think of all kinds of,
Yeah,
It's
no, it's definitely where those people go to get away from people like us. But I love Cracker Barrel.
Actually, Cracker
I
Barrel
can't-
sounds like, I won't say
I
it.
was
That's-
introduced
I
to
hate
Cracker
some of these
Barrel
jokes.
by,
The torture device me and Pascal have. Put them in the
introduced to
Cracker Barrel.
by a black
I was
man.
going to say that it was like the transportation class reserved for white people.
Okay. We're going, Chris, I'm going to send you a new link. Pascal, Kuba, I'm going to send you guys a new link. Everybody else, I'm going to put the link up in Patreon. Just wait. Be patient. Be patient. And we are out.